my name is Chuck Durham, and I'm a Tetra Tech, and we're one of the contractors that do a lot of the PCIs and PCAs and program reviews and that sort of thing for the various regional boards. And Sheen Lee is my counterpart, and we've probably been coming out here longer than anybody else, I think since 2001, doing this. But we'll go through just real quick, and this first presentation is just a very basic intro to pretreatment. And does everybody have handouts, by the way? Yeah. But we'll go through the day. We're probably going to have some hands-on stuff too, a couple of exercises before you go through. That's good. Okay, so basically, pretreatment is talking about the pollutant control requirements that are designed for indirect discharges that are going into PLTWs, and the regulations don't dictate specific treatment that these industries have to have in place, but they do require them to comply with all applicable pretreatment standards. And these are just some of the acronyms that we commonly use, and we'll talk more about some of them as we go through these various presentations, but we really focus on SIUs, or significant industrial users, and that's defined by anybody that discharges more than 25,000 gallons a day of processed waste, or are subject to categorical standards, or discharge more than 5% of the total hydraulic or organic loading to a PLTW. And cities can determine that an industry is an SIU even if they don't meet those conditions, if they think they have, potential to cause harm to the treatment plant. And whether or not a city deems an industry as an SIU will determine whether or not they have to have a pretreatment program. And states may not necessarily require a city to have a pretreatment program just because they have one SIU. In Tennessee, any city that has an SIU discharging to them has to develop a pretreatment program. So that's what we have, as many programs as we do. Okay, and with respect to who has responsibilities and oversight of the pretreatment program, the control authority in California are the municipalities, because they're the ones that permit. If they have an approved program, they're the ones that permit the industry directly. For cities that do not have an approved program, then the state would become the control authority in that case, and then EPA would be the approval authority. And that is something that we're seeing when we go out and do audit inspection. In fact, this week we were doing an inspection, and the city had defined approval authority and control authority with the same definition. So they thought they were the approval authority and the control authority in their ordinance. And so they're going to go and revise their ordinance to correct that. And interference is a discharge from a facility that either alone or in conjunction with another discharge causes an NPDES violation. And interference and pass-through both are geared toward impact that results in an NPDES violation. And interference is when you're affecting the operation of the plant that results in that. And pass-through is any pollutants that get through the plant into the waters of the state and cause a violation. And it can be a result of a single discharge from a facility or in combination with some other discharge. And the primary goals of the pretreatment program are to prevent interference, prevent pass-through, and protect the safety of the workers. And we have a number of incidents, unfortunately, where individuals were either severely injured, got really sick, and have also had some fatal incidents as a result of discharges of non-domestic waste into sewers. And so, the whole idea of the pretreatment program is to prevent those things from getting into the sewer so that we can avoid those things from happening. Okay, so, and here are just some examples of some things that can happen where you're getting waste from industrial users. There are certainly instances where we had explosions. Everybody knows about the Louisville incident several years ago, where they had several miles of sewer that blew up, and that's one that you see in almost every pretreatment presentation given. They have pictures of the Louisville sewers, all cars turned upside down. Waste from industries can impact the way that cities can dispose of their sludge. It can cause them to have to spend more money to dispose of it. We had a small town in Tennessee that could not dispose of their sludge for over 2 years because of the high metal content, and it was all a result of a guy who was plating in 5-gallon buckets in his garage. And it's a very small wastewater plant too, but it can have that kind of impact if the metals were getting into the sludge and they couldn't dispose of it. and and you can have corrosion as a result of it. Typically, if you've got low volumes and large capacity lines, where you have a long detention time, and you can get corrosion as a result of that. And we have that. We had an incident with that with a General Motors facility that, when they first designed it, it was designed at 3 million gallons a day. The city built, sewer lines to take that capacity from the facility, and when the car industry went plummeting down, their flow dropped down to less than 100,000 gallons a day. So they had these big capacity pipes with very little flow. So it was sitting in the pipes for a long time, and it ended up eroding away on the sewage. Okay, so who's affected by this, and what the pretreatment program in general, and if you're not involved in it, or haven't been involved in it, well, what you find out is it's a very paperwork intensive program, and that's why a lot of the cities struggle with it, because they can go out and they know they can go out, they're aware of what their industries are doing, but they can't get a hold on the paperwork and the reporting and the documentation of what they're doing, and the regulations are very stressful to how important, or stressing on how important the documentation is. So from an approval authority standpoint, which would be the state in California, your impact is you got to make sure that the cities are compliant with their approved program. You have to make sure that they have the legal authority in place to implement the pretreatment program. You have to do PCAs and PCIs, and also occasionally you have to do a categorical determination to help them properly permit industry. So you have to be aware of the different categorical regs and how they apply and who they apply to, and really providing a lot of technical assistance to the DOTWs. And for the municipalities, they need to establish the legal authority to do permitting of non-domestic users. They have to be able to take appropriate enforcement, and they can't adopt, they can't implement things that the state hasn't also adopted from the standpoint of the streamlining regs. In California, a little different from everywhere in the country, because the state adopts federal regs whenever they're promulgated. They automatically change your state regs. That doesn't happen everywhere else in the country. And so what we run into are a lot of cities who were adopting optional provisions of the streamlining regulations when their state hadn't adopted those optional provisions. So they were having to go back and revise their ordinances again because they didn't have the authority to do that. And so it's important that the two entities work together and understand what they can and can't do. And the industrial users have have the responsibility to comply with all pretreatment standards, whether they're categorical or local limits. And the categorical standards are self-implementing in that whether or not the city has an approved program, if you've got a categorical industry present in that municipality, they have to comply with the federal standards in the reporting, whether or not the city has made them aware of that. There are a lot of cities, a lot of categorical industries in cities that do not have pretreatment programs, and Amelia's going to talk more about that later. Then other entities that might be regulated, commercial haulers, commercial entities, some retail shops are covered in the pretreatment program. A lot of the cities permit waste haulers. They may have a little more lax permits than typical SIU, but a lot of them are permitted. And I've talked about most of this already. So I've already talked about that as well. Okay. The only thing about waste haulers that I mentioned is that if the cities are gonna accept hauled waste or septic or even hauled industrial waste, they need to have a good handle on what's coming in there. Need to have a designated quantity that can be discharged. And a lot of cities do not accept septic at all. Some of them will accept industrial waste. We've got a couple of industries that are in Tennessee that have direct pipeline to the wastewater plant. And they're probably 85% of the wastewater of the flow to the plant itself. So however they go is how goes the wastewater plant. And so if they have problems, the city's probably going to violate their NPDES permit. So there are a number of options for permitting industries and waste haulers and how you want to control them. For cities that get waste from waste haulers, they typically will do random sampling. They don't necessarily sample every load that comes in. They may pull a sample but not analyze it, just to kind of keep the haulers on their toes. But they also require manifests to be submitted with each load. Okay, the first congressional act to regulate, to clean up rivers and waters of the state was in 1899, the River and Harbors Act, that basically said, don't put anything in the river that's going to impede boat traffic. You know, and over the years, there were several amendments to this law, and the Clean Water Act was put in place, and it was the first document of its kind that actually used environmental friendly terms such as fishable, swimmable. And again, you know, the primary goal of the program is to regulate indirect dischargers, and the concept being that you want to make sure that you get an even playing field of regulating industries that discharge to sewers versus those that discharge directly to waters of the state. So making sure that they don't have an impact on, again, the collection system and the wastewater plant. And under the pretreatment program, industries that might meet the definition of SIU can range anywhere from manufacturers of electrical components, metal finishers, you know, automobile, aerospace, typically toxic organic pollutant type, you know, industries that have those type of pollutants and metals in their waste stream, but then also industries that have large volume, high concentration, compatible pollutants such as dairies or food processors or industrial laundries are also typically regulated under the pretreatment program, just because of the large flow, because of the high strength waste. Okay, and so EPA developed 24 categories initially, and I think there's 28 now, 29. And primarily we're concerned with conventional pollutants because that's what the wastewater plants were being permitted for. But then, as a result of the consent decree with the National Resource Defense Council, they added the priority pollutant, 126 priority pollutants, which typically we have every municipality do at least a one-time scan of the 126 priority pollutants so that we can identify what the pollutants of concern are from all municipalities that discharge to them. And then, when the streamlining regs were modified, and the pretreatment regs were modified via the streamlining rule in 2005, the language regarding local limits was modified to include best management practices. So a narrative standard, where if you want, for example, instead of just having a numerical standard for pollutants, if you wanted to put something in where industries have to do a dry cleanup before they get a wash down their facility, you put that in a permit, that becomes a pretreatment standard that they have to comply with in order to be in compliance with the permit.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you define, again, you said it, the acronym PSES and PSNS?
Yes. Or is it?
I assume BAT is best available technology.
Yeah, and it's pretreatment standard for existing sources versus pretreatment standard for new sources.
Okay, thank you.
And they're, you know, in the definition of new sources is in the regs as well. But it basically has to do with if they were in operation when the particular categorical standard was developed and they're an existing source, and they've got 3 years to come into compliance with that standard, and new sources that come into operation after the standard is developed have a maximum of 90 days to come into compliance. And the concept being that they have an opportunity to put in the latest technology treatment so that they can comply with the standard.
Yeah, and thanks for asking that, Suzanne, because it's a question that actually comes up with municipalities a lot. Under the effluent limitations guidelines, there are pretreatment standards, and then there are direct discharge standards, which are indicated by either BPT, BCT, or BAT. But the PSES and PSNS are the only ones that are applicable to indirect discharges. The rest of them are only applicable to direct discharges.
Right. And when you go out and do audits of PCIs, that's one of the things that we look for, because we'll see that municipalities don't understand that, and they're giving the direct discharge limits to these indirect dischargers. You know, and the difference in the standards are basically taking into consideration the fact that they're discharging to a municipality, that while wastewater plants aren't typically designed to remove a lot of these pollutants, the fact is they do. And so you take into account that removal capability of a wastewater plant, and so it gives them sort of an even playing field. You know, and one of the things that we tell industries all the time is it's not a right that they have to discharge the city sewage, it's a privilege they have. They could get their own MPDS permit and have to comply with these other standards. And so it's a lot easier for them to do that, and that's why when they're When you see instances where they're threatening to leave if they don't get what they want, or take their jobs and go to the next city. The only thing the cities have to understand and hold their ground on is, you could always go get your own MPDS permit and go directly to the state, and most industries don't want to do that. But that's a good question. And all of our regs for pretreatment are found in 40 CFR Part 403, and I'm sure most people in here are familiar with the CFR manual. And the different categorical standards are found in Parts 405 to 471. And we used to carry around our manuals with us everywhere we go, but thanks to technology, we can actually download them on our iPhone now. It's a lot easier to get to.
There's an app for that.
There's an app for that.
It's the CFR app.
But I really like having the hard copy of the done through personally. It just makes it difficult to travel. Okay, so I mentioned this already. Who has developed a pretreatment program? 5 million gallons a day, and it's a lot of states require them to develop a pretreatment program, regardless of the flow of the wastewater plant, if they have significant industrial users that discharge to them. And like I said, the state may not want to put the burden of developing a pretreatment program on a small town that has one industry. Say they have a small metal finisher that's categorical, they automatically meet that definition of SAU because they're a categorical industry. The city may not have the personnel, the manpower, or the resources to develop a program and provide adequate oversight, so the state may choose to provide that oversight and just permit that industry directly. Hopefully they involve the city in calculating local limits that might be applicable that protect the wastewater plant, but that's not always the case. Okay, and again, this is sort of repetitive, but I think it's good to repeat. As far as oversight authority, the state in California should be doing approval of program submissions. If they make modifications to the program, they should be submitting those to you guys for approval. Substantial modifications have to be submitted and approved before they adopt them. Non-substantial ones have to be submitted 45 days prior to them adopting them, and that gives you an opportunity to review and give feedback. However, I do know that we've had instances where in the past Region 9 has, even after the 45 days expired, and they've not, because they may have not had an opportunity to review those documents, they found something wrong, they went back in and made the city modify language in either an ordinance or an enforcement response plan, even after 45 days was up, because we want to make sure that they have it right. There are, I think, 5 non-delegated states still, and I'll show you a map in just a second of those. And then there are, how many of you are familiar with the 40310E states? Anybody? These 5 states, 2 of them are in Region 4, 2 are in Region 1, and 1's in Region 7. Their pretreatment programs are set up where the state permits the industry directly and the cities aren't involved at all. They might review a draft permit that EPA prepares for an industry. They might look at some local limits just to get some comments back, but for the most part, they're not. And so the state permits them directly. But Mississippi, for example, they do that. They have fewer industries permitting their pretreatment program than Tennessee has municipal programs. They just don't have a lot of industry. It's a very economically depressed area. In Nebraska, everybody's farming, so they don't have a lot of industry. So the state says we can take care of all the significant industries. Yeah.
Does that bring up any confusion or conflict when you have an effluent violation, you have POTW saying it's not ours, it's your pretreatment requirement?
Well, in these states, because they're 40310E states, it gives the state that authority. The state takes enforcement action, and if they don't, then EPA will come in and take enforcement action. And that actually, I've had to deal with that because in my former job, I was the state of Tennessee pretreatment coordinator, and we are the approval authority in our state, but we have cities that are on the border of 7 states. So there's an industry in Mississippi that actually discharges to the city of Memphis. The collection system comes across state lines, and the city of Memphis didn't have authority to enforce across state lines. So the state of Mississippi was supposed to take enforcement action. Their agreement said that Mississippi would take enforcement action against them, but they never would take enforcement action for this metal finisher constantly violated. So EPA sent the state a heavy fine for not taking that enforcement action. And we've since, over 20 years of dealing with this, renegotiated that where the city of Memphis actually can enforce against Mississippi that discharges their collection system.
Well, I don't think it was really an authority issue. It was if the state established a pretreatment permit for that industry, and those limits were not stringent enough, and it caused a violation of the city's treatment plant discharge.
Mhm. It's not a matter of the limits not being stringent enough as it is.
But can the city argue that the state did not set stringent enough limits, and therefore?
Well, yeah,
it was-
they could, and that's why they get an opportunity to give comment when the limits are developed and have input. But most of them, in Alabama, for instance, I know that very few of the cities want to be involved at all. The state will go, send them the local limits that they develop based on what they see as a design criteria for the wastewater plant. But very few of the cities give any feedback at all.
So the position is, the chance was during comment period.
Right.
List it to that.
Right. It may be, and it could be that the violations are operational issues and not as a result of this.
That's what I'm getting at. Say, what if it's an operational issue, or say, you believe it's a wastewater treatment plant, but the wastewater treatment plant says, no, we think it's your pre-treatment requirements. You set up more internal litigation problems and.
Well, what you end up with are you have to look at the analytical data and are they meeting the removal efficiencies that the wastewater plant was designed for, and then they would make a decision. And it may be that they find that it's not working, so they want to go away from this 40310E delegation. But with this delegation, none of the cities are the control authority, the states are. And this is, I was hoping that we'd have wireless in here and I could pull this up. But basically, if you hit this link, you get the full version of this table right here, which basically tells you which states and the U.S. properties are delegated for MPDS, delegated for biosolids, delegated for pretreatment, and you can see where's Delaware. Delaware has MPDS delegation, but they don't for pretreatment. So for pretreatment, Region 3 does the oversight of the cities, for example. They do the audits, they do the PCIs, they do the review of program submission, any changes that the cities do. So if you go to this link and you've got it in your handout, you can see the full spectrum for all the states. And then on that same page, there's a link above it that gives you this map basically, so you can see that anytime you want. It's pretty good information to have. Okay, as far as what the responsibilities are that each entity has, the PLTWs have to review annual report. They have to submit annual reports to the state, but they also have to receive information from the industry to make sure that they're complying with their permit requirements. One of those is reviewing and not just receiving reports from them, but actually reviewing them. One of the things that we see when we go out and do these audits and PCIs is cities will get these annual reports or semi-annual reports from industry. They log it in, they met the date, they met their compliance date to submit the report, they put it in a file. They never look at the analytical data to determine whether or not they were complying with their permit. Just in recent inspections, we discovered somewhere the document wasn't, they require certification and a signature from a designated authority. There's no signature on the form that were submitted, and it even said, for example, like one of them, it said attaches our monitoring for mercury, and you look through the lab results, and mercury was not in there at all, but the city didn't catch it, so they're clearly not reviewing the reports, and that's one of the obligations they have is to review those reports, just as the state needs to be reviewing annual reports that the cities submit and make sure that they're complying with their requirements. And they also have to take states, like do audits and be willing to take enforcement action. And what happens is you have cities that are continually in violation or continually not taking enforcement action against their industries until the state makes it clear to the city that we're watching and we realize you're not in violation, that you're not running your program the way you're supposed to, and take enforcement action, whether that be an administrative order against the city or maybe bring them in for a show cause hearing and have them justify why they're not implementing their program. Something from an enforcement nature that lets them know the state's watching and is concerned about their procurement program. And I'll tell you why it's important is if the state's not watching these programs, I can guarantee the environmental activist groups are. I don't know if it's as much of a problem here. I don't hear about it as much. The bait keepers obviously have a very active group here, but In Tennessee, we've had a number of environmental activist groups that have taken enforcement action against cities for not running the pre-treatment program properly, and they can get a lot more money out of the cities than the state or EPA can. They don't have the limitations that we have. And so it's really more about providing technical assistance to the cities and helping them get their program under control so that they can avoid those unnecessary costs. And the same thing with respect to the cities. They have to be able to take enforcement action and willing to take enforcement action against the industry. In the smaller cities that have one industry that has 200 jobs in the county, they're not as likely to take enforcement action against those guys because they don't want to run them out of town. And that's unfortunate, but sometimes they have to, you have to draw a fine line there. And when you have industries that are repeatedly having the same violations, and the city's just sending them a letter and saying, hey, you violated your permit, you need to fix that. We had one city that issued 16 NOVs to an industry in a year for the same violation, and all they were getting were letters. So we took enforcement action against the city, so that they would make it economically feasible for the industry to come into compliance. You've got to take enforcement action that, as long as it's cost effective for them to be violating, they're going to continue to violate. So the cities need to be willing to take that enforcement action. And these are just some of the sections in the pre-treatment regs that talk about the implementation and like minimum requirements to go on a permit are found in 403.8, reporting requirements in 403.12. We don't have time to go into those in a lot of detail. But some of the important things that a pre-treatment program that's approved has. And really, you shouldn't be approving a pre-treatment program that doesn't have the adequate legal authority so that they can issue permits and take enforcement action and collect samples. And there's a model sewer use ordinance on EPA's website that we push every POCW toward to use for a guide in developing their ordinance. And also on that website, we have a legal authority checklist that you can use when you're reviewing these ordinances that goes line by line, and we'll go over that in a later presentation here. The other thing is they have to being able to identify industrial users. So they do an industrial waste survey, they do a broad spectrum survey, send out a checklist to all their non-domestic users and get feedback on what they're doing, what type of waste they have, what type of chemicals they have on site. But they just need to be able to figure out who's out there that could cause harm to the wastewater plant or the collection system. And then the other thing, we have a presentation on the funding and the resources that if we have time, we'll get to it at the end of the day, but I'm not sure we'll have time to do it. But basically, the pre-treatment program was set up to be a self-sustaining program so that cities would not be out any money. They should be recouping that money from the permitted industry because, as I said before, they're getting a huge benefit from discharging these cities, so they should be the ones paying that instead of the ratepayers paying extra costs to cover those large volume discharges from industry. So, the resources that they have to have include manpower and equipment, but also the funding, and they have to show that in order to get the program approved. Okay, we've already talked about this. We'll skip over this real quick. We already talked about industrial users and receiving reports. I'll get ahead of myself. The other thing that's important, cities have to do sampling that's independent of the industry sampling. The industry SIUs are required to sample twice a year in their approved program based on their flow or their potential to cause harm. The city may have them monitoring a lot more often than that. The city of Memphis has 10 industries that discharge over 5 million gallons a day each. So they're sampling daily for BOD and suspended solids, and then monthly for a larger spectrum of pollutants because they have the potential to cause harm to the treatment plant. If you've got small volume discharges, one sample every 6 months, that's the minimum to comply with 403. And then the city has to do independent monitoring once a year and also do inspections once a year. And again, those frequencies will increase based on the potential that an industry would have. But it primarily what you're looking at is, are they getting a representative a representation of what that industry has and the potential that they have to cause harm. And then also they have to make sure that they comply with all public participation requirements. If they make changes to their pre-treatment program, they need to public notice that. If and what we try to encourage cities to do is involve the permitted entities, the industries. If we're making changes to local limits, give them a chance to comment on that, maybe meet with them separately. If they're making changes to the ordinance, let them know ahead of time so they have time to comment on that. And any industries that are found to be in significant noncompliance, as defined in 403, the cities have to publish them in the newspaper at least once a year. They have to make that publication. That tends to get industry's attention more than letters, notices of violation, and even more than fines. They don't like the bad press, so they tend to avoid that if they can. And different cities handle it different ways. For instance, Nashville will publish everybody, if they have one pH violation in a year for just a millisecond, they get published in the newspaper as being in significant noncompliance. But what Nashville also does is they publish, in that publication, these are the industries that were in violation for June to December. These are the industries that were in violation the previous 6 months that have now returned to compliance. These are the industries that still can't get it right. So they're very detailed in the publication. Yes.
So the conduct random sampling, surveillance and inspection, that's the entity that's in charge of the program, so it
The
could be the state.
It could be the state, right?
Okay.
Yeah, where the state, like Mississippi, Connecticut, for example, they have to go out and do those inspections and do that sampling. And in Mississippi, like I said, they don't have that many industry. They've got 10 people that run the Pretreatment program across the state total. And one of them is assigned to the ag industry, one of them is assigned to the metal chemicals, and they go all over the state and they do those inspections. But yeah, whoever is in control in that case, and there are instances where EPA is the one who permitted the industry, and they have to go out and do those inspections. Okay, and when cities are trying to determine who they're going to permit, again, we went over the definition of SIUs, anybody that just started one with 20,000 gallons per day. But then categorical industries, anybody that meets one of those 28 now, I think, categories for which EPA has established pre-treatment standards. And as Amelia mentioned, there are the standards that are in there for each of those categories. They have effluent limited guidelines, which are the standards for direct dischargers, and in the pre-treatment, categorical pre-treatment are the ones for indirect dischargers. But in addition to the ones that meet that definition, cities may choose to also permit non-significant industries, those that have lower flows, and with the impact on or the changes to the pretreatment regs, with streamlining, we now have a classification that's called non-significant CIUs or NSCIUs, and that's categorical industries that discharge less than 100 gallons a day. So they really don't have the impact, potential to cause impact of the treatment plant. So even though they're categorical, they would have less stringent reporting requirements and sanction requirements. And a lot of cities, like I said, permit waste haulers, groundwater remediation sites, even car washes. If they've got anybody that's got an oil water separator or clarification system of any kind, cities will permit. They may have less stringent monitoring requirements on it, but they will permit it. And then they may have different permitting fees for these entities based on what their classification is as well. And they can also use general permits they may use general permits for restaurants. Everybody just get one permit, and they just get a one-page notification that says you're subject to the term of general permit, 210-4, and it's found in our office or something like that. And again, this is just this is a little schematic that shows you the possible options where if EPA is permitting industries directly, or if the state is for these 5 states that are listed here. And then this is the primary way this is done across the state, across the country. The city's the control authority, the state is the approval authority. Okay, and I think I've already talked about all this, cities don't have to give industry notification before they come and do inspections. Most ordinances have language, and if they don't, they should. So if you're reviewing ordinances, make sure that they have the authority to get into these entities. They don't have to make appointments. In some cases, it's good to schedule it because you may not find the person there that can actually explain to you what they're doing. But you have the authority, they have the authority as a control authority to get into those facilities at any time, and particularly in cases of emergency. Middle tier is another classification that was added with the streamlining that basically says if they have lower flows and it gives them reduced monitoring and inspection requirements. They only have to inspect them once every 2 years. And but in order to be able to implement these 2 classifications, the city has to adopt them in their ordinance. And if they haven't adopted those things, then they can't. And what we find is we go to these smaller cities, and they have a lot of small volume discharge in categorical industries. And then we're telling them about this, and they want to adopt it, but they want to, like, we're gonna modify their permit to make them an SCIU, but they don't have that authority in their ordinance. So they can't do it until they go through that legal process. They have to have the ability to assess penalties, up to at least $1,000 a day, and that's per day, each day is a different violation. So you need to make sure that they have that in there. And every city that has a pretreatment program must have an enforcement response plan that's been approved by the state. And we are currently working with headquarters to revise the ERP guidance. That's one of the things that's on the list for this year. It's to modify that guidance. It's from like 1989. Hasn't been updated since then, so that's on the hit list for this year. But there is guidance out there, and it's basically the purpose of the ERP, an enforcement response plan, is to make sure that cities treat similar violations from different industries in the same way, so everybody can treat fair. And the one thing that we look for is to make sure that they have escalated enforcement. Well, I mentioned the fact that the city was issuing just issuing NOVs over and over for the same violation. They're not getting anybody's attention anyway. I've already mentioned this, but it's just basically making sure that they have the resources to be able to implement their pretreatment program. That includes recouping costs for doing inspections, for going out and collecting samples, for reviewing reports, for writing permits. If you have enforcement that you have to take, you've got legal issues that you have to be able to find. And, again, ideally, EPA said those costs will go back to the industries that are permitted under the pretreatment program.
How do you judge if there's adequate resources?
Well, in Tennessee, we used to say if a city had 8 SIUs in the pretreatment program, they needed a full-time equivalent pretreatment person, and that was just sort of based on us evaluating our existing programs, and there was a line where if they didn't have one with 8, they typically didn't do as well. They weren't complying with their requirements. And EPA, there's a table in, I don't know which guidance manual it is, maybe the Intro to Pretreatment Guidance Manual, that has a table that sort of suggests the numbers for if you have this many industries, you may need this many SDs. But it's 8 was the number that we used, and it was based on who was compliant, who wasn't, basically. So I'm pretty happy with that number. But they also, again, I mentioned early on that it's a paperwork intensive program, and a lot of the requirements are based on keeping records. They have to keep a minimum of 3 years. If they go do inspections but they don't write them up, as far as EPA is concerned, they didn't do an inspection. And I've already mentioned that they have to publish these guides in paper once a year. And that's the definition of S&C. We'll talk more about in another presentation. And I know we're going through this fast, but yeah, we'll talk about all of it in more detail later. And especially, we're going to do an exercise on annual reports, I think, so we'll skip that. And I think I've already discussed all this, but if you have questions, we'll tell you this. We mentioned here some of the things that categorical industries have to do. If they're production-based, if they're subject to production-based standards, they have to provide you their production rate. We'll talk about that also. But categorical industries are required to submit baseline monitoring reports before they discharge. And baseline monitoring reports are basically a very good description of the types of processes they have in the globe and chemicals they have on site. And they need to submit that to you before they begin discharging. If it's an existing industry, they can do it based on historical data. If it's a new industry that's coming into a city and the city's asking you for, what sort of guidance that you need to give them, they can complete a baseline monitoring report based on estimated expectations of what they're going to discharge, and then maybe reevaluate those after a year.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I think you might have said this earlier, but I'm warming up here, not enough coffee.
That's fine.
I know you have industrial users, and then there's some are significant and some are categorical. Who determines that, and where is
Well, categoricals are a subset of significant. And categoricals are any of those industries that are subject to the categorical pretreatment standards for particular industrial categories, like if they're metal finishers or they're organic chemical pesticides, and they're found in 40 CFR 405 through 471, depending on which category they are. And we're going to talk more about the regs in particular. In fact, I'm hoping we're going to have time to even walk through the metal finishing regs and how they apply, because that's the most common industry.
So how does one determine that an industrial user is significant?
based on whether or not they have 25,000 gallons a day of flow, or if they discharge more than 5% of the total hydraulic organic loading to the wastewater plant, or if they're a categorical industry.
And where's?
That's in it's in 403, it's defined in 403,
Okay.
and it's 403.3T, V now, with the changes in the rate of V now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And just one caveat, like some POTWs can be more stringent on that 25,000 gallons per day. Like the facility that we went to yesterday, they made it more stringent, said anyone who discharges over 10,000 gallons per day.
Yeah,
there's
it's
a
spelled out in
penalty.
their ordinance though, and
Right.
it's spelled out in their ordinance that they can do
Right,
that.
so the federal requirement is 25, but cities and POTWs can make that more stringent
Okay,
in the
great.
ordinance.
Yes.
You mentioned the, like the non-significant categorical, or what if you have a scenario where you have a POTW that's coming to, you know, maybe they're over 80% of their design capacity, and they're under like a time schedule order or cease and desist order with the state. That's a lot of them, maybe 5 years to come into compliance and make those upgrades. But during that time, they have existing categorical or not assigned categorical use that, although they're not contributing maybe 25% of the organic loading, that in particular is the design constraint on the POTW.
Right.
What would you do then?
Well,
And they're under 25,000 gallons a day and all the other stuff, but they got a high concentrated organic discharge that maybe is, could potentially do that.
they're under the 25,000, but they're above the 100 gallons a day.
Yeah.
Which has the limitation on non-significant categorical is they can't discharge more than 100 gallons a day.
Okay.
But what you're talking about is you got an industry that's going to have impact on that wastewater plant because they're under design.
Right, but then we're still giving them sort of a, like I said, like a cease and desist order or something, or, you know, to give them time to come to compliance to upgrade that plant.
Right.
What would you do in like that time period? I mean, if the city comes to you and says, hey, we may exceed, you know.
Okay, as long as we're
because of
taking
this.
away from the industry, they may have to in turn put some sort of control on the industry until we get our upgrade.
Mhm.
We can take X volume from you, and you're going to send the other part, anything over there, you're going to send off site.
Okay.
Or if the
okay.
industry has holding capacity, they may do something with that. But the only other option is the industry could get an MPDS permit.
Well, and there's another option, like even if you have a non-categorical industry that has high strength waste but didn't qualify for the flow or the 5% capacity, there's a catch-all in that definition. It's like any IU that the POTW deems that, you know, could discharge anything harmful to the POTW, the POTW can classify that industry as a significant industrial user. And they do that, they can put in their permit limitations for BOD or whatever pollutant.
Or limit their flow.
Right, or
Yeah,
limit their flow, or the time of flow, how it's discharged, prevention of sludge,
Yeah,
and
no,
stuff like that.
the flip side of that is even if they discharge more than 25,000 gallons a day, a city may deem that they don't have an impact and you don't have to define them as an SIU. So there are a lot of cities that have industrial laundries that have 50,000 gallons a day, but they don't permit them as SIU because they've got a 10 MGD plant.
Does the city have a choice about whether or not to accept the waste?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're the control authority.
Right. So they can't just, so the industry can't say, oh, well, you know, we're significant, we're just gonna, we're gonna discharge.
Here we
we're gonna
come,
comply
take it or
with-
leave it,
yeah,
right.
right, we're gonna comply with
Right.
the regs and.
No, they can't do that. In fact,
Okay.
I just got an email from somebody in Mississippi yesterday, and there's a POTW and the industry is wanting to discharge a diluted glue to them.
Right.
And they're like, right now what they're doing is they're evaporating it off. It gets watered down in the process, and they're evaporating it off and disposing of it as a solid. But what they want to do is just continue watering it down and then flush it down the drain. And the only argument is that's what we do with 3 other facilities,
Right.
and we don't even have a permit from those cities. Because they're arguing about having a permit.
Because the city will save money on coagulants.
They will. But here's the issue with that, and we see that all the time, is, sometimes maybe you discharging to Memphis that has a 130 MGD wastewater plant, and there are other facilities discharging the one that has a 5 MGD wastewater plant,
Right.
and you can't compare those impacts. And getting industry to understand that sometimes is difficult. But yeah, there are options for monitoring that industry that you brought up. Good question. I'm not going to talk about these because I know we're going to talk about them later. And just real quickly, significant industries have an obligation to report on the status of their compliance with their permit. And then also, if you, the city has an obligation under the pre-treatment program to evaluate all their SIUs and see if they have the potential to discharge a slug loading to a wastewater plant. And that could be a spill, but it also could be a non-episodic sort of discharge. For instance, a dairy has a bad batch of processed waste that they want to dispose of. They may put it on a holding tank and leave it in a little over time, or they may just release the valve. And they may call the city and say, hey, we've got some, 5,000 gallons that we want to dispose of. Then that's going to be a slug discharge that could have an impact on the wastewater plant. And the city should have them develop a slug discharge control plan. 403 spells out what has to be in that plan that basically ensures the industry has measures in place that they do pre-notification to the city that it's coming. They train their employees on what those procedures are. They don't just open valves without calling anybody. They don't dump spent tanks down the drain. And we had an incident several years ago in Tennessee where an employee dumped a 55-gallon drum of paint down the sewer. It turned the wastewater plant red. It turned the receiving string red across 2 counties. Massive fish kill, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. It was not good. But having that, so just having training for employees is part of the slug discharge control plan. So they have to have those if they have that potential. And it's the city's job to ensure that those plans are being implemented. Okay, and then the other thing, I mentioned this earlier, we had an industry that submitted some annual report and they didn't have the proper signature or certification statements on there. But somebody had to sign these reports, and basically the certification statement spelled out in 403 says, I certify that all the information in here is accurate and true, or I certify that we did not have any discharge in the last 6 months. And I don't know how many of you are familiar, several years ago, San Jose actually had an enforcement case for a zero discharging industry. They've been permitted zero discharging for years, but they were having heavy metals showing up at the wastewater plant unusual. They did, 18 months of CSI work to go back and figure out who the source of that was, and it was an industry that was every 6 months signing zero certification statements. We had no discharge, and they were illegally discharging their waste. They were basically taking the pipe, and they were moving a sealed pipe that goes to sewer and sticking a hose from the treatment system down in there and dumping it late at night. And the really funny thing about it is the owner, when they first investigated there, assured the criminal investigators that nobody in his place would do anything illegal like that. In fact, he had installed a video camera to make sure his employees behaved. He's the one on video camera doing it, and spent, still in jail right now as a result of it. But I actually have the video. There is a guidance manual on the introduction to the National Pretreatment Program, and it was also, and you'll see references this a lot, it was also one of the Pretreatment 101. Are y'all familiar with the Pretreatment 101 webcast? EPA headquarters has done about 8 so far. Tetra Tech actually helped them do these. In fact, this one, I don't know who the speaker is, but he sounds really good looking. You can go to EPA's website, and there are about 8. There's one on inspections. Is there one on permitting?
There is.
One on permitting. One on doing the industrial user surveys. One on sampling.
One on local limits.
One on local limits. We're going to do another one on local limits also. We're going to do another one on permitting later this year, I think. But they're archived and available, and you can pull those up anytime on the EPA's website. And I think they're very helpful, especially for people who are just getting involved in the pre-treatment program. So I recommend you go there and look at those. And then, just real quick, some of the things that we're working on now. These are some of the guidance manuals that we have been revising for headquarters, and all of these are actually on EPA headquarters desk. We're under review right now. As soon as we get feedback from them, I expect that the first 2 will probably go out this year.
You forgot to.
Well,
Evaluation formula.
but I know they're not turning up on them.
It's on.
I don't care. They're not going out this year. And the haul waste guidance is also EPA being reviewed. So you may be seeing a lot of these manuals. The IU permitting manual actually went out. What we did to expedite that process, we separated the appendices from the guidance manual so that we could get the guidance manual out. I think it was posted in 2010. And we're doing the appendices as separate documents on the website, and to get those done and approved through EPA, through all the legalese, then they'll be posted. And then the other thing headquarters is doing is offering assistance to the various EPA regions with audits and inspections similar to what we do here in Region 9, except it's under a separate contract. You know, even if you've got local limits or program submission for a city's trying to get a program approved, EPA is offering assistance for regions and states on eliminating some of those backlogs. And that's it.